The mashed potatoes had gone cold on Sarah's plate, congealing into pale mountains that reminded her of the snow-capped peaks she'd once dreamed of climbing. The dining room felt smaller tonight. The mahogany table that had hosted 3 generations of Chen family dinners now seeming to press against her ribs with each labored breath. Across from her, her father's voice cut through the air like shards of winter glass. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 28 years old and still playing with finger paints? Richard Chen said, his chopsticks clicking against his porcelain bowl with the precision of a metronome. When I was your age, I already had my engineering degree and was supporting a family. Sarah's fingers tightened around her water glass, the condensation making her grip slippery and uncertain. Beside her, her 6-year-old daughter Emma sat with the stillness that children learn when adult voices carried too much weight. The little girl's dark eyes moved between her mother and grandfather like a spectator at a tennis match, cataloging every serve and volley of disappointment. "Sarah helps kids," Emma said, her voice cutting through the adult conversation with the clarity that only children possess. "She helped Tommy draw his scary dreams away." Richard barely glanced at his granddaughter. "Children don't understand the real world, Emma. Your mother needs to learn that good intentions don't pay bills or build security." The ceiling fan above them turned with a lazy whir, stirring the air without cooling the heat that was building in Sarah's chest. She watched her father's face, noting the way his mouth turned down at the corners when he spoke about her work, the same expression he'd worn when she'd changed her major from pre-med to psychology, when she'd married David against his wishes, when she'd decided to keep Emma after the divorce. "You know what your problem is," Richard continued, apparently warming to his subject. "You're too soft, too emotional. You let your feelings make your decisions instead of your brain. Look where it's gotten you. Divorced, living in that tiny apartment, working for peanuts." Sarah's mother, Linda, sat at the far end of the table, her silence as familiar as the floral wallpaper that had hung in this room for 15 years. She picked at her vegetables with surgical precision, her eyes focused on her plate as if the pattern of peas and carrots held the secrets of the universe. This was her way, to weather her husband's storms by becoming invisible, by offering neither resistance nor support. "I'm helping people heal," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength despite the tremor in her hands. "The kids I work with have been through trauma, abuse, neglect, violence. Art gives them a way to process emotions they don't have words for." "Emotions," Richard scoffed. "Everything is about emotions with your generation. What about practical skills? What about building something that lasts? You're 30 years old." 28, Sarah corrected automatically.
28, 30, what difference does it make? You should be established by now. You should be thinking about Emma's future instead of indulging in these hobbies. Emma's grip on Sarah's hand tightened. The little girl had been drawing pictures all week of her mom at work, colorful scenes of children laughing and painting, of Sarah kneeling beside tiny easels with a patient smile. Those drawings were taped to their refrigerator at home, a gallery of love and pride that stood in stark contrast to the gallery of achievements that surrounded them now. "It's not a hobby," Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "I have a master's degree in art therapy. I've been working with children for 5 years. I have certifications, training, experience." "Experience in what? Coloring? Playing dress-up?" Richard's laugh was harsh, brittle. "Sarah, wake up. You're living in a fantasy world. Real careers require real qualifications, real dedication, not this touchy-feely nonsense you've convinced yourself is important." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each syllable designed to diminish everything she'd worked for, everything she believed in. She thought of Marcus, the 8-year-old who hadn't spoken for 6 months after witnessing domestic violence, who had finally communicated through a painting of a house with no doors. She thought of Lily, who had drawn her anxiety as tangled black lines that gradually became rainbows over months of sessions. She thought of the breakthrough moments, the small victories, the children who had learned to trust again because she had shown them a safe space to express their pain. "Those kids need me," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. They don't have anyone else who listens to them, who sees them as more than their trauma. They need professional help, Richard replied dismissively. Real therapy, medical intervention, not art projects. The dining room chandelier cast fractured light across the table, illuminating the remains of their dinner like evidence at a crime scene. Sarah could see her reflection in the darkened window beyond her father's shoulder, a ghostly image that looked tired and defeated. She wondered when she had started seeking his approval again, when she had begun measuring her worth against his expectations instead of trusting her own judgment. Emma had gone very quiet, her small body pressed against Sarah's arm. The child's breathing was shallow, rapid, the way it got when she was trying not to cry. She recognized the signs, she had seen them in countless children, who had learned that adult anger was something to be feared, something that might explode without warning and consume everything in its path. "Dad," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice level for Emma's sake, "I understand that you want security for Emma and me, but what I do matters. I'm making a difference in these kids' lives." "Making a difference," Richard shook his head. "You sound like a greeting card. Life isn't about making yourself feel good by helping people. It's about building something substantial, something that lasts. Your little art sessions might make you feel important, but they don't change anything fundamental about these children's situations." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture that had been growing for years. She thought of her daughter's downturned face and realized that Emma was absorbing every word, learning lessons about worth and value that would echo through her own future relationships. "You're wrong," Sarah said quietly. "You're wrong about everything." The words hung in the air between them, surprising everyone at the table, including Sarah herself. Richard's eyebrows rose, his chopsticks pausing halfway to his mouth. Linda finally looked up from her vegetables, her eyes wide with something that might have been fear or hope. "Excuse me?" Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Sarah felt Emma's hand squeeze hers 3 times, their secret signal that meant "I love you." It was a code they had developed after the divorce, a way to communicate affection when words felt too big or too scary. The simple gesture filled Sarah with courage she hadn't felt in years. "You're wrong," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "You're wrong about my work, about its value, about what matters. You measure everything in degrees and dollars, but you can't quantify hope. You can't put a price tag on a child learning to trust again."
Richard set down his chopsticks with deliberate precision, the small sound echoing in the sudden silence. "Sarah, you're being dramatic. I'm trying to help you see reality." "No," Sarah said, standing up so suddenly that her chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "You're trying to make me small so that you can feel big. You're trying to diminish my work because it threatens your worldview." Emma scrambled to her feet as well, her small hand still clutched in Sarah's. The child's face was pale but determined, her dark eyes fixed on her grandfather with an intensity that belied her age. "Mummy helps people," Emma said, her voice clear and strong. "She's a hero." Richard's face flushed red, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. "Emma, adults are talking. You don't understand." "I understand plenty," Emma interrupted, and Sarah felt a surge of pride at her daughter's courage. "I understand that Mommy makes sad kids happy. I understand that she works really hard and loves what she does. I understand that you're being mean to her." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She looked at her father's face and saw something she'd never seen before. Uncertainty, perhaps even shame. But then his expression hardened again, his features settling back into their familiar mask of authority and control. "Emma, that's enough. You're being disrespectful." "And you're being cruel," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger and pain, "to both of us." She gathered Emma's jacket from the back of her chair, her movements quick and decisive. "We're leaving." "Sarah, don't be ridiculous," Linda spoke up for the first time, her voice thin and pleading. "Sit down. We can work this out."
But Sarah was already moving toward the door, Emma's hand warm and trusting in hers. As they reached the threshold, she turned back to face her parents, seeing them framed by the formal dining room with its heavy furniture and suffocating expectations. "I love you," she said, the words surprising her with their truth, "but I won't let you make me hate myself anymore, and I won't let Emma learn that love comes with conditions and qualifications." Richard opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time in Sarah's memory, her father seemed to have nothing to say. As they walked to the car, Emma tugged on Sarah's hand. "Mommy, why does Grandpa say mean things about your job?" Sarah knelt down beside their old Honda, looking into her daughter's serious face. The street lights had begun to flicker on, casting golden pools on the sidewalk where she had learned to ride her bike, where she had drawn hopscotch squares with chalk, where she had dreamed of becoming someone who mattered. "Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand," she said carefully. "Grandpa thinks that only certain kinds of work are important because that's how he was taught to think." Emma considered this, her forehead wrinkling in concentration. "But you help kids feel better. That's the most important job ever." As Sarah buckled Emma into her car seat, she caught a glimpse of the dining room window. Her parents were still sitting at the table, two silhouettes against the warm light, and she wondered if they were talking about what had just happened or sitting in the silence that had defined so much of their marriage. The drive home was quiet, Emma falling asleep in her car seat before they'd gone 3 blocks. Sarah's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she navigated the familiar streets of her childhood neighborhood, past the park where she had played as a child, past the school where she had first discovered her love of art, past the coffee shop where she had worked summers to pay for college. 20 minutes later, as she carried her sleeping daughter up the stairs to their apartment, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted tonight. The fracture in her chest had become a clean break, separating her from years of seeking approval that would never come, from measuring her worth against impossible standards, from trying to make herself small enough to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. Emma stirred as Sarah tucked her into bed, her dark eyes opening briefly in the glow of the nightlight. "Mommy, are you sad?" "A little," Sarah admitted, smoothing her daughter's hair. "But sometimes being sad is part of becoming stronger." Emma nodded sleepily, her trust absolute and unconditional. "I love you, Mommy. You're the best art teacher ever." As Sarah stood in her daughter's doorway, watching the rise and fall of Emma's chest in the dim light, she thought about the question that had been forming all evening. What kind of woman did she want Emma to become? What lessons about worth and value and love did she want to pass down to this bright, brave little girl who saw the world with such clarity? The answer came to her with stunning simplicity. She wanted Emma to become someone who trusted her own judgment, who valued her own contributions, who never apologized for taking up space in the world. Someone who measured success not in degrees or dollars, but in moments of connection, in lives touched, in love freely given and gratefully received. Sarah closed Emma's door softly and walked to her own room where the walls were covered not with awards and accolades, but with her daughter's artwork, finger paintings of flowers, crayon drawings of their cat, construction paper hearts with "I love Mom" written in careful, crooked letters. It was a different kind of gallery, one that celebrated not achievement, but affection, not accomplishment, but presence. As she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself thinking about tomorrow's sessions at the community center. There would be Marcus, who had been having nightmares again since his mother started dating someone new. There would be Lily, who was learning to draw her feelings instead of keeping them locked inside. There would be a dozen other children who needed someone to see them, to listen to them, to believe in their capacity for healing and growth. The work was hard, often heartbreaking, and yes, it didn't pay as much as her father thought she deserved. But it was hers, chosen freely and pursued with passion, and it mattered in ways that couldn't be quantified or measured against anyone else's expectations. Sarah turned off the lights and climbed into bed, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she lay in the darkness thinking about the moment when Emma had stood up to Richard, when her 6-year-old daughter had shown more courage and clarity than any of the adults at that table. What had made that possible?
What had given Emma the strength to speak truth to power, to defend love against cynicism? The answer, Sarah realized, was simple. Emma had been raised to believe that her voice mattered, that her feelings were valid, that love was not conditional on performance or achievement. She had been taught to see the world through the lens of compassion rather than competition, to measure worth not in external validation but in internal integrity. And if Sarah could give that gift to Emma, perhaps she could give it to herself as well. Sarah woke at 5:30 a.m., 45 minutes before her alarm was set to ring. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against her bedroom windows like a heavy blanket, and for a moment she lay still, letting the events of the previous evening wash over her in waves of memory and regret. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, finger paints and charity work and touchy-feeling nonsense, each phrase a small wound that hadn't had time to heal. She rolled over and checked her phone, scrolling through the messages that had accumulated overnight. Her mother had texted at 11:47 p.m. "Your father is just worried about your future. You know how he shows love." The words made her stomach clench. Love that came disguised as criticism, affection that required her to shrink herself down to an acceptable size. She had been accepting that bargain for too many years. In the kitchen, Sarah moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, grinding coffee beans and preparing Emma's lunch with the automatic precision of single motherhood. The ritual of measuring and packing, of checking and double-checking, had become a meditation over the past 3 years since her divorce. Each carefully wrapped sandwich, each precisely portioned snack was an act of love, a promise that someone in this world was paying attention to Emma's needs.
The refrigerator hummed quietly, its door covered with Emma's artwork and school announcements, soccer schedules, and grocery lists. Among the papers was a photo from last week's community center open house. Sarah kneeling beside a group of children, all of them grinning at the camera with paint-stained fingers and proud expressions. She looked happy in the picture, purposeful in a way that had nothing to do with her father's definitions of success. "Mommy?" Emma's voice drifted from the hallway, thick with sleep and confusion. "Why are we up so early?" Sarah glanced at the clock. 6:15 a.m., still 15 minutes before their usual routine. "I couldn't sleep, sweetheart. Do you want to help me make pancakes?" Emma appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones covered in tiny rainbows that she'd insisted on wearing 3 nights in a row. Her dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and there was a crease on her cheek from her pillowcase. She looked impossibly young, innocently beautiful in the way that children could be before the world taught them to question their worth. "Can we make them into shapes?" Emma asked, climbing onto her step stool at the counter. "Whatever shapes you want," Sarah said, pulling the mixing bowl from the cupboard. As they measured flour and cracked eggs, she found herself studying her daughter's face, looking for signs of damage from the previous night's confrontation. But Emma seemed untroubled, chattering about her friend Madison and the butterfly they had found at recess, her natural resilience already working to process and integrate the difficult emotions. It had always amazed Sarah how quickly children could bounce back from adult conflicts, how they instinctively knew which battles were theirs to fight and which belonged to the grown-ups around them. Emma had witnessed plenty of arguments during the final months of Sarah's marriage, had heard raised voices and slammed doors and all the messy realities of a relationship falling apart. Yet, somehow, she had emerged from that chaos with her sense of security intact, her belief in love unshaken. "Mommy, are you and Grandpa fighting?" Emma asked as she stirred the pancake batter with intense concentration. Sarah paused, her hand hovering over the vanilla extract. How much truth could a 6-year-old handle? How honest could she be without burdening Emma with adult complications? "We had a disagreement," Sarah said carefully. "Sometimes adults don't see things the same way." Emma nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense. "Like when you and Daddy used to disagree about bedtime." The comparison was both heartbreaking and apt. Sarah's divorce from David had been relatively amicable. Their disagreements centered more on logistics than fundamental incompatibilities. They had simply grown apart, become different people with different dreams, and eventually acknowledged that they were better as co-parents than as spouses.
But her relationship with her father was more complicated, rooted in decades of unspoken expectations and conditional approval. Something like that, Sarah said. But you know what? Even when people disagree, they can still love each other. Emma looked up from the mixing bowl, her dark eyes serious. Do you still love Grandpa? The question hit Sarah with unexpected force. She set down the vanilla extract and really considered it, searching her heart for an honest answer. Yes, she loved her father, loved him in the complicated way that children always love their parents, even when those parents fail to see or celebrate who they really are. But she was beginning to understand the difference between loving someone and accepting their judgment of her worth. Yes, I do, she said finally. But love doesn't mean we have to agree about everything, and love doesn't mean I have to let him make me feel bad about myself. Emma stirred the batter thoughtfully. Madison's grandpa tells her she's the smartest girl in the world. He comes to all her soccer games and cheers really loud. The innocent observation was like a knife to Sarah's chest. She thought about all the school plays and art exhibitions that her father had missed, all the achievements that had been met with criticism instead of celebration. She thought about Emma growing up wondering why her grandfather couldn't see her mother's value, why love in the Chen family came wrapped in disappointment and conditional approval. Some grandpas are better at cheering than others, Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral.
As they cooked pancakes shaped like butterflies and flowers, Sarah found herself remembering her own childhood mornings in her parents' kitchen. Her mother had been the one making breakfast then, moving through the same rituals with the same quiet efficiency, while her father sat at the table reading the newspaper and offering commentary on Sarah's homework, her posture, her plans for the day. Even as a child, Sarah had sensed that her father saw her as a project to be improved rather than a person to be celebrated. She had been a good student, an obedient daughter, a source of pride when she succeeded and disappointment when she fell short of his expectations. But she had never been enough, exactly as she was, without modification or improvement or striving towards some impossible standard of perfection. The pattern had followed her into adulthood, shaping her relationships and her self-perception in ways she was only beginning to understand. She had married David partly because her father approved of his engineering degree and steady income, had pursued her master's degree partly to prove that she was serious and qualified and worthy of respect. Even her work with children carried traces of that need for validation, that desire to be seen as someone who mattered. But somewhere along the way, the work had become something more. The children she served had taught her about authenticity, about the courage to express pain and fear and hope without apology. They had shown her that healing was possible, that growth could happen in the presence of unconditional acceptance, that love was most powerful when it came without conditions or qualifications. "Mommy, you're burning the pancake," Emma said, pointing to the skillet where a butterfly had turned distinctly brown around the edges. Sarah laughed, flipping the pancake and rescuing it from total disaster. "Good catch, sweetheart. I was thinking too hard." "Your daddy says you do that a lot," Emma observed, not unkindly. "He says your brain is always working on big problems." It was true. Sarah had always been a deep thinker, someone who processed experiences slowly and thoroughly, who needed time and space to understand the emotional complexities of relationships and decisions. David had appreciated this quality during their marriage, had often sought her perspective on difficult situations. But her father had always seen it as weakness, as evidence that she was too sensitive, too emotional, too caught up in feelings to make practical decisions. As they ate breakfast together, Sarah watched Emma carefully cut her butterfly pancake into manageable pieces, her small hands steady and sure. The child approached the task with such focus and intention, as if the proper consumption of a pancake were a matter of great importance. There was something beautiful about her seriousness, something precious about the way she gave her full attention to whatever task was before her. "Emma," Sarah said impulsively, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" Emma considered the question while chewing.
her expression thoughtful. "I want to help people like you do. Maybe I could be an art teacher too, or maybe a doctor who draws pictures for sick kids." The answer filled Sarah with a complex mixture of pride and concern. She was touched that Emma wanted to follow in her footsteps, but she also worried about passing down the burden of seeking approval, of measuring worth through service to others. "You can be anything you want to be," Sarah said carefully. "The most important thing is that you choose something that makes you happy, something that feels true to who you are." "What if other people don't like what I choose?" Emma asked, and Sarah realized that even at 6, her daughter was already learning to navigate the complicated dynamics of family expectations and personal authenticity. Sarah made a silent
Promise to herself to model courage and self-acceptance, to show Emma that it was possible to love people while still honoring your own truth. After breakfast, as they prepared for their respective days, Sarah found herself moving with unusual intentionality. She chose her clothes carefully, a flowing skirt and comfortable sweater that made her feel both professional and creative, both competent and feminine. She packed her bag with extra supplies, anticipating that some of the children might need longer sessions after processing whatever had happened in their homes over the weekend. "Are you going to see Tommy today?" Emma asked as she shouldered her school backpack. "I am. He's been working on a painting of his family. Want to guess what colors he's been using?" Emma grinned. "All the rainbow colors, because families should be happy and bright." The innocent observation was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Emma's understanding of family was still uncomplicated, still rooted in the belief that love was simple and joyful and unconditional. Sarah hoped she could preserve that innocence as long as possible, could protect Emma from the more complex realities of adult relationships and family dysfunction. The drive to Emma's school was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into the carpool line, Emma turned to face her mother with serious eyes. "Mummy, are you sad about Grandpa?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "A little bit, but mostly I'm proud of how brave you were last night. You stood up for something you believed in, and that takes real courage." Emma beamed at the praise, her face lighting up with the pure joy that children felt when they knew they had done something right. "Madison says her mom is brave too. She's a nurse and she helps people even when they're really sick and scary." "That is brave," Sarah agreed. "There are lots of different ways to be brave. Sometimes it's helping sick people. Sometimes it's standing up to someone who's being mean. Sometimes it's just being yourself, even when other people don't understand." As Emma disappeared into the school building with a final wave, Sarah sat in her car for a moment, watching the stream of children and parents navigating the morning routine. So many families, each carrying their own secrets and struggles, each trying to balance love and expectations and the complicated realities of raising children in a world that could be both beautiful and harsh. She thought about the children she would see today at the community center, Marcus with his nightmares, Lily with her anxiety, all the others who had been hurt by the adults in their lives and were learning to trust again. They came to her sessions carrying invisible wounds, hearts full of confusion and pain and fear. But they also carried incredible resilience, an innate capacity for healing that never failed to humble and inspire her. This was why she did the work, she realized, not to prove her worth to her father or anyone else, but because these children needed someone to see them, to believe in their capacity for growth and healing, to offer them tools for expressing what they couldn't put into words. The work mattered not because it impressed people at dinner parties or generated impressive salaries, but because it addressed genuine human need with compassion and skill. As Sarah dove toward the community center, she found herself thinking about the conversation she needed to have with her parents. The confrontation from the night before had been necessary, but incomplete, a first step towards establishing healthier boundaries, but not a final resolution. She would need to find a way to communicate her feelings without attacking, to assert her worth without diminishing theirs, to create space for a relationship that honored both her father's concerns and her own authentic path. But first, she had work to do, children to serve, healing to facilitate, small miracles to witness in the quiet moments when pain transformed into hope. It was work that couldn't be measured in traditional metrics of success, but it was work that mattered in the deepest and most fundamental ways. The community center parking lot was nearly empty when she arrived.
the morning light casting long shadows across the pavement. Sarah gathered her supplies and headed inside, ready to begin another day of the work that had chosen her as much as she had chosen it. In a few hours, this building would be full of voices and laughter and the quiet concentration of children discovering that they could create beauty from pain, that they could tell their stories in colors and shapes and find healing in the telling.
The Riverside Community Center occupied a converted warehouse on the edge of downtown, its brick walls painted a cheerful yellow that never quite managed to disguise the building's industrial origins. Sarah had fallen in love with the space 5 years ago, drawn to its high ceilings and large windows, the way natural light poured across the polished concrete floors and made everything feel open and hopeful. The building had housed a textile factory in the 1940s, a furniture store in the 1980s, and finally a community arts center that served the diverse neighborhood surrounding it. As Sarah unlocked the door to her classroom, she breathed in the familiar sense of tempera paint and paper, clay dust and markers, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the administrative offices down the hall. This was her sanctuary, the place where she felt most herself, most capable of making the kind of difference that couldn't be captured in performance reviews or quarterly reports. The room was arranged with intentional care. Child-sized tables clustered in informal groupings, easels positioned near the windows, supply stations organized for easy access. The walls were covered with artwork from previous sessions, a rotating gallery of self-portraits and dream images, family drawings and emotion paintings. Each piece told a story of breakthrough or struggle, small victories achieved one brushstroke at a time. Sarah moved through her morning setup routine, filling water containers and arranging brushes, checking that each table had paper and basic supplies. She had learned over the years that preparation was crucial to the therapeutic process. Children who were dealing with trauma needed to feel safe and supported, and that safety began with the physical environment. When everything was in its proper place, when the space felt welcoming and organized, children could focus on the much harder work of exploring their inner worlds. At 9:30, her first client arrived. Marcus Washington was 8 years old. Small for his age, with enormous dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything and reveal nothing. His mother, Keisha, worked 2 jobs to support him and his younger sister, and she always looked exhausted when she dropped him off, grateful for the sliding scale fee structure that made Sarah's services accessible to families who couldn't afford traditional therapy. "How are you feeling today, Marcus?" Sarah asked as she helped him out of his jacket, noting the way his shoulders hunched forward, the careful distance he maintained even as he settled at his usual table. "Okay, I guess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus had been coming to sessions for 6 months, ever since he had witnessed his father hitting his mother during one of their increasingly volatile custody exchanges. The incident had triggered nightmares and school problems, regression in his toileting and eating habits, the kind of complex trauma responses that could take years to fully address. "Would you like to work on your house painting today? Or try something new?" Sarah asked, offering him choices in the way she had learned was most empowering for children who had experienced powerlessness. Marcus considered the options, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that spoke of anxiety and contained energy. Maybe I could paint what I dreamed last night." This was significant progress. When Marcus had first started coming to sessions, he had refused to acknowledge his dreams at all, had claimed he didn't remember anything when he woke up. The fact that he was willing to give visual form to his nighttime experiences suggested that he was beginning to develop some distance from them, some sense that he could have control over how they affected him. "That sounds like a brave choice," Sarah said, setting up the supplies he would need. "Remember, you can make the dream any color you want. Sometimes when we paint scary things, we can change them into something less frightening." As Marcus began to work,
Sarah moved around the room, preparing for the other children who would arrive throughout the morning. She checked her notes from the previous week, reminding herself of where each child was in their healing journey, what breakthroughs they had achieved, and what challenges they were still facing. Lily Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, arrived at 10:15 with her grandmother, Mrs. Chen, who spoke limited English but communicated volumes through her worried expressions and gentle touches. Lily was 7, dealing with severe anxiety following her
Parents' contentious divorce. She had started having panic attacks at school, had developed a stutter that made it difficult for her to communicate verbally. But she had shown remarkable progress through art therapy. "Good morning, Lily," Sarah said in the soft voice she used with particularly sensitive children. "I see you brought your special pencils today." Lily nodded shyly, clutching the set of colored pencils her grandmother had bought her, top-quality supplies that represented a significant investment for a family living on a fixed income. The child's attachment to these tools was both touching and telling. In a world where so much felt uncertain, the pencils represented something that was entirely hers, something she could control and use to create beauty. While Lily settled at her table and began her usual ritual of arranging her pencils in rainbow order, Sarah checked on Marcus. His painting was taking shape as a swirling mass of dark blues and purples, with small flashes of red that seemed to represent either fire or blood. In the center of the composition, barely visible in lighter shades, was the outline of a figure that might have been a child. "Can you tell me about this part?" Sarah asked, pointing to the hidden figure. "That's the boy in the dream," Marcus said, his voice distant and matter-of-fact. "He's hiding so the angry man can't find him." Sarah nodded, making a mental note to explore this protective mechanism in future sessions. Marcus was beginning to externalize his trauma, to see himself as separate from the violence he had witnessed. This was often a crucial step in the healing process, the moment when children began to understand that they were not responsible for the adult's behavior, that they had worth and agency independent of the chaos around them. By 11 o'clock, 3 more children had arrived. Aiden, a 10-year-old whose parents were going through a bitter custody battle, Sophia, an 11-year-old who had been placed in foster care after her mother's drug overdose, and Jamie, a 9-year-old who had selective mutism following a car accident that had killed his father. Each child carried their own burden of pain, their own unique constellation of symptoms and coping mechanisms. Sarah moved between the tables like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony of healing, offering encouragement here, asking gentle questions there, providing technical guidance when needed, but always allowing the children to lead their own creative processes. This was the delicate balance of art therapy, being present and supportive while resisting the urge to interpret or direct, creating a safe container for expression while trusting that the children knew what they needed to communicate. "Miss Sarah," Lily called out in her soft, stuttering voice, "can you help me with the clouds?" Sarah knelt beside Lily's chair, studying the drawing that was taking shape on her paper. It showed a house with a garden, rendered in meticulous detail with her precious colored pencils. But the sky above was filled with dark, threatening clouds that seemed to press down on the peaceful scene below. "Those are some very dramatic clouds," Sarah observed. "What do you think they might be feeling?" Lily's forehead wrinkled in concentration. They're mad and scared, and they don't know where to go." The description could have been applied to Lily, Sarah realized. The child was caught between her parents' anger, displaced and uncertain, trying to create beauty and stability while storm clouds gathered overhead. "Do you think the clouds might want something? Maybe they have needs that aren't being met?" "Maybe they want someone to listen to them," Lily said thoughtfully. "Maybe they want to tell their story, but nobody knows how to hear cloud language." The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze Sarah.
In a few simple sentences, Lily had articulated the core challenge of trauma recovery, finding ways to communicate experiences that seemed impossible to put into words. The clouds in her drawing were perfect metaphors for the emotional storms that raged inside her, storms that felt overwhelming and dangerous, but that also carried the potential for growth and renewal.
Across the room, Marcus had added new elements to his painting. The hidden figure was still there, but now there were other shapes around it, protective barriers or maybe helping hands. Sarah made another mental note to ask him about these additions, to explore what resources he was discovering within himself, what strength he was beginning to recognize. Sophia, meanwhile, was working on what appeared to be a self-portrait, but one that showed her at different ages simultaneously. There was a toddler version holding a teddy bear, a school-age version reading a book, and an older version that looked sad but determined. The technique was sophisticated for an 11-year-old, suggesting an artistic talent that was being nurtured despite the chaos in her personal life. "That's a very interesting way to show yourself," Sarah commented, as she paused beside Sophia's cable. "My foster mom says I'm mature for my age," Sophia replied, not looking up from her work. "But sometimes I still feel like a little kid who just wants her mom to come home." The honesty in her voice was heartbreaking. Sophia had been in the system for 8 months, moved between 3 different homes as social workers tried to find the right fit. Her mother was in a residential treatment program, working toward recovery, but with no guarantee of success, no timeline for reunion. Sophia was learning to navigate a world where love came with expiration dates, where attachment was dangerous because it might be severed without warning. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself thinking about the previous night's confrontation with her father. Here in this room, surrounded by children who were dealing with real trauma and genuine hardship, his criticisms seemed both smaller and more significant. Smaller because she could see so clearly the value of what she was doing, the necessity of providing these children with tools for healing and expression. More significant because she understood how easily his worldview could infect her own sense of purpose, how his dismissal of her work could undermine her confidence if she let it. At 11:30, Dr. Patricia Williams arrived for her weekly consultation. Dr. Williams was a child psychologist who contracted with the community center to provide clinical oversight for the art therapy program. She was in her 60s with gray hair and kind eyes, the sort of person who commanded respect through competence rather than authority. She had been Sarah's mentor since the beginning, offering guidance on difficult cases and validation for the progress that was often too subtle for administrators to notice. "How are your kids doing this week?" Dr. Williams asked, as she settled into the chair Sarah kept in the corner for observation and consultation. "Marcus is externalizing more," Sarah reported, keeping her voice low so the children couldn't overhear. "He's starting to create protective figures in his paintings, which suggests he's developing some sense of agency around his trauma." Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "And Lily? She's still struggling with the divorce proceedings, but her imagery is becoming more complex. She's using metaphors now. Clouds for emotions, gardens for safety. I think she's beginning to understand that feelings can be temporary, that storms pass." They continued their review of each child's progress, noting breakthroughs and setbacks, adjusting treatment plans based on the previous week's observations. It was meticulous work, requiring both clinical knowledge and artistic intuition, the ability to read meaning in color choices and brushstrokes, in the things children chose to include and the things they left out. "Sarah," Dr. Williams said after they had finished discussing the children, "I wanted to talk to you about something else. The hospital has been asking about expanding our trauma program. They're looking for someone to develop art therapy services for their pediatric unit.
Sarah felt a flutter of interest mixed with apprehension. Working at the hospital would mean higher pay, better benefits, more traditional prestige. It would also mean leaving the community center, abandoning the children who had come to trust her, stepping away from the inclusive, sliding scale model that made therapy accessible to families who couldn't afford private practice rates. It would be a significant opportunity, Dr. Williams continued. Better resources, more support, opportunities for research and publication. I think you should consider it seriously. Before Sarah could respond, a commotion erupted from Marcus's table. The boy had knocked over his water container, sending murky paint water cascading across his work onto the floor. His face was flushed with anger and frustration, his small hands clenched into fists. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "It's ruined!" he cried, his voice cracking with emotion. "Everything is ruined!" Sarah was at his side immediately, kneeling in the spreading puddle without concern for her clothes. She understood that this wasn't really about the painting. This was about powerlessness, about a world where beautiful things could be destroyed without warning, about the terrible fragility of safety and order. "Hey, buddy," she said gently, "accidents happen. Let's see what we can save." "No," Marcus shouted, pushing away from the table. "I don't want to save it. I want it to be ruined. I want everything to be ruined." The other children had stopped working, their attention drawn to Marcus's outburst. Sarah could see anxiety flickering across their faces. They knew what it felt like when emotions became too big to contain, when the careful control they maintained threatened to collapse entirely. "It's okay to feel angry," Sarah said, her voice calm and steady. "Sometimes we need to let the angry feelings out before we can make space for other feelings. Can you show me how angry you are? Can you make your whole body angry?" Marcus stared at her, confusion replacing some of the rage in his expression. This wasn't the response he had expected. No scolding, no demands that he calm down, no shame about his emotions. "Like this?" he asked, tensing his muscles and making his face fierce. "Yes, exactly like that. You look very angry. How does it feel in your body when you're that angry?" "Hot," Marcus said, his breathing still rapid but becoming more controlled. "And tight, like everything is squeezing." "That sounds really uncomfortable," Sarah acknowledged. "Do you think your body might want to try a different feeling now? Maybe something that feels less hot and tight?" Marcus nodded slowly, his shoulders beginning to relax. Sarah guided him through some simple breathing exercises, then helped him create a new painting. This one intentionally messy, full of bold strokes and powerful colors that expressed his anger without being destroyed by it. The incident was a reminder of why this work mattered, why the children needed someone who understood that healing wasn't linear, that progress could be messy and complicated, and sometimes look like regression. In a hospital setting, there would be pressure to document outcomes, to show measurable improvement, to justify the program through statistics and success rates. Here, at the community center, she had the freedom to trust the process, to believe that small moments of understanding and acceptance could accumulate into lasting change. As the morning session drew to a close, Sarah helped the children clean up their workspaces and prepare to leave. Each goodbye was carefully orchestrated. These children had often experienced sudden separations and abandonment, so predictable routines around arrivals and departures were crucial for maintaining their sense of security. "Will you be here next week, Miss Sarah?" Lily asked as she carefully packed her colored pencils. "I'll be here," Sarah promised, the words carrying more weight than they might have in other circumstances. For these children, consistency was everything. The knowledge that she would be here, in this room, ready to witness their expressions and honor their experiences, was often the foundation that made all other healing possible.
After the morning session drew to a close, Sarah sat in the quiet classroom processing the evening's events. The water stain on the floor had dried to a faint shadow, barely visible unless you knew where to look. In a few days, even that would be gone. But the moment of breakthrough it represented, Marcus's willingness to express his anger directly, his trust that it would be met with acceptance rather than judgment, would remain.
Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway, ready to continue their interrupted conversation about the hospital position. "You handled that beautifully," she said. "Marcus has never expressed anger so directly before. That's real progress." "He's been holding it in for months," Sarah replied. "I think he needed to know it was safe to let it out." "That's exactly the kind of insight that would serve you well in a hospital setting," Dr. Williams observed. "You have exceptional instincts with traumatized children. The position would allow you to reach more kids, work with a broader range of cases." Sarah stood and began wiping down the tables, needing something to do with her hands while she processed the offer. "What about the kids here? They've already lost so much. Parents, homes, stability. I can't just disappear from their lives too." "The center would find someone else," Dr. Williams said gently. "Good art therapists are rare, but they exist. These children would be served, just differently." But would they? Sarah wondered. Would another therapist understand Marcus's need to hide before he could emerge? Would they recognize the sophisticated symbolism in Lily's cloud imagery? Would they have the patience to sit with Sophia's complex grief, to honor both her maturity and her childlike needs? The question felt larger than her own career decisions. It was about continuity and trust, about the way healing happened in relationship rather than in isolation. It was about the difference between serving children and serving systems, between measuring success in changed lives and changed statistics. As she locked up the classroom and headed to the administrative offices to complete her documentation, Sarah found herself thinking about Emma's words from the night before. "Mommy helps people. She's a hero." The simplicity of that assessment cut through all the complexity of career advancement and professional recognition. At the end of the day, the question wasn't whether her work impressed other people or generated impressive salaries. The question was whether it served the children who needed it most, whether it created space for healing and growth and hope. In the parking lot, Sarah sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine. Through the windows of the community center, she could see other programs in session: seniors learning computer skills, teenagers participating in job training, young mothers attending parenting classes. The building hummed with activity, with people helping people, with small acts of service that would never make headlines, but that mattered immensely to the individuals involved. This was her world, she realized. Not the world of prestigious positions and impressive credentials, but the world of direct service and genuine impact. It was a world her father might never understand or value, but it was the world where she felt most authentic, most useful, most alive. The drive home gave her time to think about the conversation she would need to have with her parents. Not the confrontation from the night before, which had been necessary but incomplete, but a deeper dialogue about values and priorities, about the different ways people could measure a life well lived. She wanted Emma to understand that success came in many forms, that the most meaningful achievements were often the ones that couldn't be quantified or compared. But first, she had a daughter to pick up from school, homework to supervise, and dinner to prepare. The ordinary tasks of single motherhood that required her full attention and presence. As she pulled into the school pickup line, Sarah found herself smiling. Whatever challenges lay ahead, difficult conversations with her father, decisions about her career, the ongoing work of healing traumatized children, she would face them with the same patience and acceptance she brought to her art therapy sessions. One moment at a time, one choice at a time, one brushstroke at a time.
"Will you come to my art show, Mommy?" Emma asked as they climbed the stairs to their second-floor apartment. "Of course I will," Sarah said, fumbling with her keys. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." Emma beamed, then grew thoughtful. "Will Grandpa and Grandma come too?" The question hit Sarah unexpectedly. She paused with her key halfway in the lock, realizing that she hadn't even considered whether to invite her parents to Emma's school events. The confrontation from the night before had created a rift that felt both necessary and painful, and she wasn't sure how to bridge it without compromising the boundaries she was trying to establish. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly. "We'll have to see." Inside their apartment, Sarah moved through the familiar rhythm of after-school time, unpacking Emma's backpack, checking for homework and permission slips, starting a snack. The space felt particularly cozy today, with afternoon sunlight streaming through their small windows and illuminating the gallery of Emma's artwork that covered the refrigerator and kitchen walls. As Emma settled at the dining table with her math worksheet, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. Her heart jumped when she saw her mother's name on the screen. "Can we talk? Your father feels terrible about last night." Sarah stared at the message, feeling a complex mixture of hope and skepticism. Her father feeling terrible was progress, but she had learned over the years to be cautious about his rare moments of regret. Often they were followed by expectations that she should simply forgive and forget, that acknowledging the hurt was enough to erase its impact. She typed and deleted several responses before settling on, "I'm free to talk after Emma goes to bed around 8:30. The response came quickly. "Yes, I'll call then. We love you both." For the rest of the afternoon, Sarah found herself distracted, running through possible conversations in her mind while helping Emma with homework and preparing dinner. Part of her wanted to believe that something fundamentally had shifted, that her father's criticism had been replaced by understanding and acceptance. But a larger part of her knew that real change took time, that one difficult conversation rarely transformed decades of ingrained patterns. At 6:30, Emma was in the middle of a detailed story about the butterfly life cycle project her class was doing when Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. It was her father calling, not her mother, an hour and a half early. "Hello, Dad," she answered cautiously. "Sarah." His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less certain than usual. "I hope I'm not interrupting dinner." Emma looked up from her plate, her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Sarah gave her daughter a reassuring smile while her pulse quickened. "We're just finishing up," Sarah said. "What's on your mind?" There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence that suggested Richard was struggling to find words. Sarah had rarely heard her father sound uncertain about anything, and the novelty of it was both alarming and intriguing. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally, "for last night, for the things I said about your work." Sarah felt Emma's eyes on her, watching her reaction to whatever was happening on the other end of the phone. She walked into the living room, seeking some privacy for what promised to be a difficult conversation. "Okay," she said carefully. "I'm listening." "After you left," Richard continued, his voice gaining strength, "your mother and I talked for hours. She helped me understand some things about myself, about how I've been talking to you. I don't think I realized how dismissive I've been, how much my words have hurt you." The admission was so unexpected that Sarah had to sit down. She perched on the edge of their secondhand couch, trying to process this version of her father, vulnerable, accountable, apparently capable of self-reflection. "Thank you for saying that," she managed. "It means a lot to hear you acknowledge it." "There's more," Richard said. "I've been thinking about what Emma said about you helping kids. I realized I don't really know what you do, not specifically. I've been judging your work without understanding it."
Sarah closed her eyes, feeling a cautious hope blooming in her chest. "It's complicated work," she said. "It's not always easy to explain to people who haven't seen it in action." "Could you try?" Richard asked. "Could you help me understand what art therapy actually is? Why it matters?" The question was so genuine, so different from his usual lectures and pronouncements that Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She thought about Marcus and his protective figures, about Lily and her emotional clouds, about all the children who had learned to trust again through color and shape and patient acceptance. "It's about giving children a way to communicate when words aren't enough," she began. When kids have been through trauma, abuse, neglect, violence, family dissolution, they often can't talk about their experiences directly. The emotions are too big, too scary, too complicated for their developmental level. Richard made a small sound that might have been understanding or encouragement. Sarah continued, her voice growing more confident as she found her rhythm. Art becomes a bridge between their inner world and the outside world. They can express their fears and hopes and confusion through images, and I can witness those expressions without judgment. Over time, that witnessing helps them process their experiences, develop coping strategies, begin to heal. "Give me an example," Richard said. Sarah thought for a moment. "There is a boy I work with, I can't use his name, who witnessed domestic violence. For months, he drew pictures that were all dark colors, chaotic scribbles that seemed to have no form or meaning. But gradually, tiny figures started appearing in the paintings, hidden at first, barely visible. As he felt safer in our sessions, the figures became more prominent, more detailed. Eventually, he painted a whole scene where the small figure had helpers, protectors, sources of strength." "And that helped him how?" Richard asked. "It helped him externalize his trauma, to see himself as separate from the violence he witnessed. It helped him recognize his own resilience and begin to imagine a future where he wasn't defined by what happened to him. The art gave him a way to tell his story and reclaim his power within it." Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "How do you know if it's working? How do you measure progress?" It was exactly the kind of question Sarah would have expected from her father, practical, focused on outcomes and evidence, but she sensed genuine curiosity behind it now, rather than skepticism. "Sometimes it's obvious. A child who hasn't spoken starts talking about their artwork. Someone who's been having nightmares begins to sleep better. Panic attacks decrease. School performance improves. Family relationships become healthier. And sometimes the changes are subtler. A child starts using more colors in their paintings. They begin to include people in their drawings where before they only drew objects. They develop the ability to sit with difficult emotions without becoming overwhelmed. Those kinds of changes might not show up on a standardized assessment, but they're profoundly important for long-term healing." Sarah heard Emma calling from the kitchen, something about needing help with the last math problem. She held up one finger, asking her daughter to wait a moment longer. "Dad, I need to help Emma with homework, but I'm grateful that you called, that you're asking these questions. Could I—" Pause, seeming to struggle with something. "Could I see where you work sometime? Meet some of the people you work with? I think I need to understand better what you're actually doing." The request was so unexpected that Sarah had to process it for several seconds. Her father wanting to visit the community center, to see her in her professional environment, to meet Dr. Williams and the other staff members. It represented a level of interest and respect that she had never experienced from him. "I would love that," she said, meaning it completely. "Let me talk to my supervisor about the best way to arrange a visit. We have to be careful about confidentiality with the children, but I'm sure we can figure something out." "Thank you," Richard said. "And Sarah, I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the living room for several minutes, trying to absorb what had just happened. The conversation felt surreal, too good to be true, like something she might have fantasized about but never expected to experience in reality. "Mommy, I really need help with this math problem," Emma called again, and Sarah shook herself out of her reverie. "Coming, sweetheart," she called back. But as she stood to join her daughter at the dining table, her phone buzzed with another message. This one was from Dr. Williams. "Sarah, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the hospital position. They're hoping to have someone in place by the end of the month. I know it's a big decision, but I think you should seriously consider it. The opportunity might not come around again for a while." Sarah stared at the message, feeling the weight of competing possibilities. Just an hour ago, the choice had seemed clear. Stay at the community center, continue serving the children who needed her most, maintain the relationships and continuity that made healing possible. But now, with her father expressing genuine interest in her work, with the possibility of his respect and understanding finally within reach, the decision felt more complicated. Would he be more proud of her if she took the hospital position? Would his newfound appreciation for her work be contingent on her achieving more traditional markers of success? Or had something deeper shifted, something that would allow him to value her choices regardless of their prestige or financial rewards? "Mommy, you're standing there like a statue," Emma observed, looking up from her math worksheet. "Are you thinking about big problems again?" Sarah smiled and joined her daughter at the dining table, pushing aside her own concerns to focus on the immediate task of helping with homework. As they worked through the final math problem together, she found herself studying Emma's face, noting the concentration and determination that seemed to come so naturally to her, the way she approached challenges with curiosity rather than fear. This was what she wanted to preserve, Sarah realized. This sense of confidence and capability, this belief that problems could be solved with patience and effort, this trust that the adults in her life would be present and supportive when she needed help. These qualities were more valuable than any degree or salary or professional recognition. After Emma was in bed, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, thinking about the day's revelations and the decisions that lay ahead. The conversation with her father had been a gift, an unexpected opening toward the kind of relationship she had always hoped they might have. But it also raised new questions about her own motivations, about how much of her career choices were driven by authentic passion and how much by a need to prove herself to him. The truth was probably some complicated mixture of both. She had chosen art therapy because she was genuinely called to the work, because she had experienced firsthand the power of creative expression to heal and transform, but she had also chosen it in part because it represented a rejection of her father's values, a declaration that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with money or status or conventional achievement. Now, with the possibility of his acceptance and understanding, she needed to examine her motivations more carefully. If she stayed at the community center, would it be because the work truly served her and the children she helped, or would it be because changing course might seem like an admission that his original criticisms had been valid? Sarah's phone rang at exactly 8:30, and she saw her mother's name on the screen. She answered with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, sweetheart. I wanted to check in about your conversation with your father. He said it went well?"
It did, Sarah said. He was different than I've ever heard him. More open, more willing to listen. Did something happen after I left last night? Linda was quiet for a moment. We had a long talk, a very long talk. I think I may have said some things that were overdue. This was intriguing. Sarah's mother had always been the peacekeeper in the family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and encouraged everyone to just get along. The idea that she had confronted Richard directly, that she had pushed back against his treatment of Sarah, was almost as surprising as his willingness to apologize. "What kind of things?" Sarah asked carefully. "I told him that his constant criticism was pushing you away from us. I told him that Emma was old enough to understand when her grandfather was being unkind to her mother and that she was learning lessons about family relationships that we might not want her to learn." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her mother, mixed with sadness that it had taken so long for these conversations to happen. How did he respond? At first he was defensive, said he was just trying to help you see reality. But then I asked him to imagine how he would feel if his father had talked about his engineering career the way he talks about your art therapy. I asked him if he would want Emma to grow up thinking that love comes with conditions, that approval has to be earned through specific achievements. The questions struck Sarah as profound, cutting to the heart of family dynamics that had shaped her for decades. She thought about Emma's unconditional trust, her easy affection, her assumption that love was simple and abundant and freely given. "I think that got through to him," Linda continued. "He started talking about his own father, about the pressure he felt to succeed, to prove himself worthy of respect. I think he realized he was passing down patterns he never meant to perpetuate.
This revelation reframed so much of Sarah's understanding of her father. She had always seen his criticism as evidence of his disappointment in her, his frustration with her choices and priorities. But perhaps it was also evidence of his own unhealed wounds, his own struggle with perfectionism and conditional love. "Mom," Sarah said slowly, "why didn't you speak up before? All these years, why didn't you tell him how his words affected me?" Linda sighed deeply. "I suppose I thought it was easier to keep the peace, to let things smooth over on their own. I didn't want to make waves. But watching Emma's face last night, seeing how she was taking it all in, I realized that staying quiet wasn't actually keeping the peace. It was just avoiding conflict while allowing harm to continue." The honesty was both painful and liberating. Sarah thought about all the times she had wished her mother would stand up for her, would challenge Richard's pronouncements and defend Sarah's choices. She had interpreted her mother's silence as agreement or indifference, but perhaps it had been something more. A learned helplessness, a fear of confrontation that had its own roots in family patterns and past experiences. "I'm proud of you for speaking up. It must have been difficult." "It was terrifying," Linda admitted, "but I kept thinking about Emma, about the kind of family I want her to experience when she comes to visit us. I want her to see adults who treat each other with respect and kindness, who celebrate each other's gifts instead of focusing on perceived shortcomings." The conversations were both draining and elating. Sarah felt that the family dynamics had shifted in subtle ways that opened up possibilities that would have been unimaginable even a few weeks ago. They talked for another 20 minutes, processing the previous night's events and discussing the possibility of Richard visiting the community center. Linda was enthusiastic about the idea, suggesting that seeing Sarah and her professional environment might help him understand the scope and sophistication of her work. "He's always been someone who learns better through direct experience than through abstract discussion," Linda observed. "Once he sees what you actually do, meets the people you work with, I think he'll have a completely different perspective." After they hung up, Sarah sat in her quiet kitchen, feeling cautiously optimistic about the future. The conversations with both parents had revealed depths of reflection and growth that she hadn't expected, possibilities for healing that extended beyond her immediate
Concerns to the family patterns that would shape Emma's understanding of love and acceptance. But she also felt the weight of new responsibilities. If her father was genuinely trying to change his approach, if her mother was finding her voice after years of silence, then Sarah had an opportunity and an obligation to respond with grace and openness. She couldn't let old resentments prevent new possibilities from taking root. The decision about the hospital position felt less urgent now, but no less complex. Tomorrow, she would need to think seriously about what she wanted her career to look like, what kind of impact she wanted to have, what legacy she wanted to leave for Emma and the children she served. But tonight, she was content to sit with the possibility that relationships could change, that people could grow and heal and find new ways of connecting across old wounds. It was the same hope she carried into every art therapy session, the belief that transformation was always possible when it was approached with patience and compassion and unwavering faith in human resilience. As she prepared for bed, Sarah checked on Emma one last time. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully, one arm wrapped around her favorite stuffed animal, her face relaxed and trusting. In the soft glow of the nightlight, Emma looked impossibly young and infinitely precious, a reminder of everything that mattered most in Sarah's carefully constructed life. Whatever decisions lay ahead, whatever challenges and opportunities presented themselves, Sarah would face them with Emma's well-being as her guide. She would choose the path that allowed her to model courage and authenticity, that demonstrated the values she wanted her daughter to inherit, that created space for all of them to grow and heal and become more fully themselves. The future felt uncertain, but hopeful,
filled with possibilities that hadn't existed just 24 hours before. And for now, that was enough. 2 years later, Sarah stood at the podium in the main auditorium of the Children's Hospital, looking out at an audience of medical professionals, social workers, administrators, and community advocates. The Conference on Trauma-Informed Care had drawn participants from across the region, and Sarah's presentation on integrating art therapy into pediatric medical settings was the closing keynote of the day. "When I first started working with traumatized children," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "I thought my job was to help them process their past experiences. What I've learned is that my real job is to help them envision their future selves, to see themselves as people with agency, creativity, and the capacity for joy despite whatever pain they've endured." In the audience, she could see familiar faces. Dr. Williams, who had become her research collaborator and co-author on several published studies. Tom Rodriguez, who was implementing art therapy programs across multiple community centers. Her hospital colleagues, who had initially been skeptical of creative interventions, but had become ardent supporters after seeing the results. And in the third row, sitting between her mother and Emma, now 8 years old and radiating pride, was her father. Richard Chen attended every presentation Sarah gave, asked thoughtful questions about her research, and had become one of the most passionate advocates for arts-based healing interventions she knew. "The children you'll see in these video clips have given permission for their stories to be shared," Sarah continued, advancing to her first slide. "What you'll notice is not just their artistic development, but their growing sense of themselves as whole people rather than collections of symptoms or diagnoses." The presentation that followed was the culmination of 2 years of careful documentation and analysis. Sarah had chosen to take the hospital position, but with conditions that allowed her to maintain her community center work and develop a model that bridged institutional and community-based care. The result was a program that served children across the socioeconomic spectrum while maintaining the accessibility and inclusivity that had always been central to her values. Marcus appeared on the screen in a video clip from the previous month. Now 10 years old, he was leading a workshop for younger children, teaching them techniques for expressing difficult emotions through color and shape. His confidence was remarkable, his natural leadership skills fully emergent, his trauma history visible only in the particularly empathetic way he worked with children who were struggling.